here's a question. What exactly are we trying to achieve when we make philosophical arguments, right? Like when I give an argument for a philosophical position, what am I aiming to do with that? I was sort of thinking there's a lot of justifications of philosophy that are sort of indirect, right? There are like accounts of the sort of good of philosophy that will tell you why philosophy is worthwhile. They'll tell you why philosophy is making an important contribution in one way or another. But these accounts don't they don't directly justify philosophical arguments. So let me give you an example, right? So um, one sort of view is, well, the good that you get from philosophy, the point of philosophy, is to kind of help us map out conceptual space, right? So when we look at the history of philosophy, we find that philosophers don't tend to converge on the truth. They don't tend to get at the correct positions in the way that we might think that scientists, for example, seem to do so. Or maybe we don't want to say that scientists get at the truth. They don't converge on the facts, but certainly scientists do seem to converge in terms of accepting the same sort of theories, right? Like all scientists accept the modern evolutionary synthesis. All scientists accept the Big Bang model. You get convergence on particular theories and models, and that happens, and that allows for progress over time. You don't really see that in philosophy, or at least not in the same sort of way. But the thought is, well, maybe philosophy, instead of producing convergence on particular positions, maybe it allows us to map out the available space, right? Like we can map out conceptual space. So uh, like philosophers disagree just as much on moral realism versus moral anti-realism as they did 30, 40 years ago. But we have a much better sense now of what the different positions are, what their logical relations are, etc. So we've mapped out conceptual space. So that's one justification for philosophy, but like even if you think that that's worthwhile, obviously that's not what philosophers are actually doing when they present arguments, or at least it doesn't seem to be, right? Like I'm not just trying to map out conceptual space when I talk about moral realism versus anti-realism. I'm giving arguments to the effect that moral realism is false and moral anti-realism is true. So it's like we have a justification, but it's sort of indirect. Similarly, some people might say, well, the good of philosophy is that it promotes skeptical attitudes, questioning attitudes. It helps society to resist dogmatism. Maybe that's true, but again, what we're actually doing is giving arguments for positions. Some people say that philosophy might sort of serve as a kind of incubator for sciences. So you know, like philosophy like lays the foundation, and then sciences branch off from it. So maybe psychology began as philosophy and then branched off once the foundations were laid. That's like another sort of view of the good of philosophy. And again though, that doesn't sort of it's justifying it, but it's like justifying it indirectly. So if somebody asks me what the point of philosophy is, I can give these sort of answers, if I find any of them persuasive, um, and that might answer that question. But it still leaves me, right, when I'm actually in the process of giving an argument for a philosophical position, it still leaves me without a sort of foundation for that, or without a justification for that. So, like, even if philosophy as a discipline can be justified by these kinds of reasons, like, I still face this question of, okay, what's the point of the arguments that I'm producing right now? Because, so I know that if I'm giving an argument against moral realism, for instance, uh, I mean, I'm not just trying to map out conceptual space. I'm not just trying to promote general skeptical attitudes. I'm not just trying to lay the foundations for science, or a future science or something along those lines. So it still leaves me with this question of, all right, what's the point of the arguments I'm producing? And I think this is probably the same could be said for many other philosophers as well. Um, I mean, I mean, yeah, it's just like, okay, even if I can justify the discipline in general, or I can say that philosophy in general is worthwhile because it has these goods, those seem to be indirect and sort of disconnected from what I'm actually doing. Um, so, yeah, what is the point then? What am I trying to do when I give philosophical arguments? Well, one natural answer is that I'm trying to convince people. There's a position that I think is right, and I'm trying to persuade other people that the position is right. Um, I mean, I have to say that this sort of answer has doesn't really resonate with me. I don't really think I am trying to convince people. Um, I mean, there are some cases where I am. So with respect to like maybe ethics and political philosophy, not that I really do those very often, but if I'm giving an argument in ethics or political philosophy, then I probably will have a mind like that will be one of my goals usually is to convince people because obviously I would like to live in a world in which most other people share my values. I want to bring people around to my way of thinking when it comes to ethics and political philosophy. Yeah, obviously, right? Like if I am in favor of particular social norms, I want other people to accept those norms. But when it comes to like metaphysics, epistemology, aesthetics. I mean, I don't know. I don't. It doesn't really bother me if other people have different views there. So, for instance, it's not a problem to me if other people are moral realists. I've never really had the goal of trying to convince people to give up moral realism. Um, in many ways, I kind of like the fact that other people are moral realists because that gives me like there's like an alternative position there that I can engage with. I mean, so even if I find it puzzling or implausible or whatever, I quite like that. One of the reasons why I went into philosophy was precisely because I enjoy engaging with other positions, right? Um, and I think that probably comes out in my videos, insofar as a lot of my videos, I think, um, are quite fair. I mean, I would hope that they are. I think that certainly the lecture style videos, maybe the videos like this, maybe not so much, because I'm kind of talking more off the top of my head. It's a lot more difficult to be fair when you're talking like this. So these kinds of videos are probably, just really sloppy and and very biased and so on. But when I do the lecture videos, I really make an effort to like take these other positions seriously and present them in the strongest form possible. And again, I think this is probably true for a lot of other philosophers as well. I know a lot of, I mean, I just do. I know a lot of people who are in philosophy who don't really seem to be that concerned about gaining converts, right? Like they enjoy the diversity of views and they're happy, they're quite happy with that, right? So, um, maybe my goal doesn't really seem to be to convince people. And the other problem with saying that the point of philosophical arguments is to convince people is that people can be convinced by all sorts of things. Like if the goal is to convince people, then we're really in the domain of rhetoric, right? It's not really clear that this is what philosophers are trying to do. So that like if you want to talk about convincing people, then it looks like you might want to be looking more at the way that politicians produce arguments. And that's obviously very different to the kind of arguments that philosophers produce, right? So the kind of arguments that will be effective at gaining converts are quite different to the kind of arguments you find philosophers making. So even if your goal as a philosopher is to bring other people to your cause, it's not obvious that the sort of arguments you're producing are going to be particularly effective at that. Because look, I mean, even among philosophers, like a lot of us, people in general, right, have severe cognitive deficiencies, right? So, um, you know, the sort of arguments that we find convincing, that human beings tend to find convincing, um, are not the kind of like very careful, sophisticated, logically rigorous arguments that philosophers often produce. Um, so, okay, maybe I'm not trying to convince people. Maybe the point is maybe the point of these arguments is just to figure out what's true or false, right? Um, like I'm presenting arguments and evaluating arguments with a view to figuring out what's correct and incorrect. Um, this obviously isn't going to work in domains where I don't think there's a fact of the matter, which actually I'm increasingly inclined to think of a lot of domains, but certainly, so domains like ethics, obviously, as a moral anti-realist, I don't think there's a fact of the matter there. Um, in political philosophy, again, I don't really think there's a fact of the matter. I mean, there can be, right? There can be facts there can be conditional facts. So we can say things like, if you want such and such, then such and such is the best means of achieving that goal. But with respect to the sort of fundamental values that one accepts, obviously I don't think there's a fact of the matter there. So there are certain domains of philosophy where I'm just going to say, well, there is no truth or falsehood to be had. And even in those domains where there is a fact of the matter, I mean, is that just a matter of my judgment then? Like, when I engage with these arguments, am I just trying to figure out which arguments I find persuasive? I mean, generally speaking, single individuals are not particularly reliable. It makes sense to sort of, it makes more sense to me to think of knowledge as a kind of social enterprise that requires interaction with others, because I have all sorts of biases and so on. So that doesn't seem quite right. Um, so uh, so yeah, I'm not sure. One thing that I will say that I've encountered quite a lot, and I've actually done this myself in the past, is that when thinking about the types of arguments I produce and what the goal is, um, it's I've often seen this framed in terms of rationality, right? So if we take, for instance, the debate between moral realists and moral anti-realists, um, I've often seen like moral realists and anti-realists each will frame their arguments as attempts to show that the position is rationally acceptable. And again, this is something that I've done as well, right? So I have, right, presented arguments in the past where I'm like, okay, the goal of this argument isn't really to convince people. I recognize that the opposition would, reject this argument at various points, but this is supposed to provide a kind of rational justification. It's supposed to show that the position can be held rationally. Um, and this is something which I increasingly feel like this is just kind of pointless, because I think rationality is sort of too easy to be had. So, um, as an example of this, right, consider something like color. Um, Different views of the metaphysics of color. So let's suppose that Verity works in fashion, and so she's often concerned with colors because she's designing clothes and so on, and colors are often an important part of clothes design. And anyway, she just assumes that colors are mind-independent properties of objects. Maybe they're not, right? Like, there are powerful arguments against this. There are lots of good reasons to be skeptical of color realism. But Verity just assumes that colors are mind-independent properties of objects. She just assumes color realism. And let's assume that Verity is aware of the fact that lots of people are skeptical of color realism, but she just sort of doesn't care because she also knows that there are plenty of intelligent people who do endorse color realism. And she's just not that interested in this debate, right? So it's like we're imagining a person who just intuitively finds color realism appealing, is aware of the fact that there are lots of people who are skeptical of color realism, but also isn't interested in the debate, and knows that there are plenty of intelligent people who do defend color realism. I think that what I would want to say is, it seems to me that Verity isn't making any kind of rational error in just continuing to believe color realism, right? Um, so, I mean, one way to put it is, what mistake is Verity making here? Well, she might be mistaken about the metaphysics of color, obviously. So maybe she has a false belief. If it turns out that the people who are skeptical of color realism are right, then Verity's got a false belief. So she's making a mistake in that respect. But of course, that false belief doesn't really matter to her, right? So, like, yeah, she doesn't care about that really, right? So it's just that her natural way of thinking about color, the way of thinking about color that she finds most appealing, is color realism. And obviously, being a color realist isn't going to interfere with any of her goals with respect to fashion. I mean, it really doesn't make any practical difference at all whether you endorse color realism or color subjectivism or color interactionism or whatever other view is on the table. I mean, this is like a kind of abstract metaphysical question. It doesn't make any difference to one's practice. So she can just go ahead, be a color realist. That's not really going to interfere with anything, and she doesn't have any. It seems to me she doesn't really have any reason to change that. I mean, like I guess we can say that her position is not adequately justified, but like again, why should she care? Why is that a problem? It doesn't seem to me that there's any irrationality here. So my point is that rationality, I think, is just very easy. It's easily had. It's easy to have a position that is rational. So I guess to go back to the moral realism, anti-realism example, if you suppose that Sidney is an ethicist and he's maybe interested in, like, maybe he's a utilitarian, right? So he's interested in promoting utility, and he just assumes that there are moral facts, that utilitarianism is correct. So when he says that people ought to donate to such and such charity, or people ought to stop eating meat, or whatever, that this claim is stance independently true. Well, okay, what mistake is he making? Obviously, as a moral anti-realist, I'd say that he's mistaken about what the facts are. Because I don't agree with his metaphysics, but let's say that again, right? He doesn't particularly care about this debate, and he knows that there are plenty of intelligent people who are defending moral realism, and it's not making any difference to his practice, right? So whether he's a moral realist or anti-realist, let's just assume, doesn't make any difference to the particular normative, that like first order normative claims that he endorses. So this doesn't make any practical difference to him. He just finds it natural to think in terms of realism, and again, this just isn't interfering with anything that he wants. It's not causing any problems. Like that doesn't seem to me to be irrational. So I feel like rationality is sort of fairly easily had, and it then makes me think, well, okay, I can present some argument to the effect that my position is rational, but that's not really saying much. That's not interesting. Like it seems like when I am engaging in a philosophical debate, I should be saying something more than that. I should be trying to do something more than just show that I'm rational. I mean, we do have some reason to talk in terms of rationality or irrationality, because sometimes we will be accused of irrationality. So if somebody claims that my position is irrational, well, obviously it makes sense for me to dispute this, and it makes sense for me to give arguments to the effect that, like, no, this is perfectly rational. But that's kind of that's a defensive move, right? I mean, I'm going to do that when I'm accused of irrationality. But uh, I mean, I'm increasingly inclined to think that this question of like the rationality or irrationality um, of particular philosophical positions is maybe not that interesting. Um, uh, so it's like, yeah, I can give an argument for the rationality of my position, but I'm not sure that that's a good or interesting argument by philosophical standards, um, because rationality is too easy to is too easy to have, you know. Um, so, but then of course that raises the question of, what would be a good argument, or what is the point of this? And I'm not sure. So I'm not really sure. Um, what I'm saying here. I don't really have a conclusion to this. So um, I kind of feel like I had something more substantive to say, but I don't know what that might have been. And I can't really be bothered to like do any editing on this. So I'm probably just going to stop now and upload this as it is. Uh, Um, yeah, okay. Well, um, so I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure what the point is of giving philosophical arguments. I think that I can show that the positions I hold are rationally acceptable, but I kind of feel like almost anyone can do that. Like like even positions that I think are just completely wrong or crazy. Um, I think you can show that they're rational. Like, because really, all you sort of have to do is, um, I mean, one thing like all you really have to do, I guess, is to sort of maybe change your goals, right? Or not change your goals, but just show that you have goals such that holding those positions becomes, consistent with those goals, or is the best way of realizing those goals, or something like that. Um, so I guess the point is this, right? Like, in the case of, let's take the moral realism case, and somebody says, here's an argument to the effect that moral realism is rational. And I want to say, well, yeah, okay, but like even somebody who just doesn't care about this, who doesn't bother thinking about this, who just goes with moral realism because that's the position that they're initially attracted to, and they don't see any particular reason to doubt it, and it's not causing them any problems, right? Like that person is perfectly rational in endorsing moral realism. But obviously, like, shouldn't we be doing more than that? I mean, when we give a philosophical argument, um, it seems it seems like we should be doing more than just showing that we can sort of have the same epistemic status as this person who you know doesn't care about the debate. Uh, so that would then suggest that maybe the goal should be to perhaps convince other people, or do something more. But I'm not sure. I'm going to leave it there. So thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.